Imagine that reality is far larger than the narrow path your senses allow you to see. A vast landscape filled with outcomes, identities, and experiences you have not yet stepped into. Perhaps the future you long for is not merely a distant fantasy waiting to be created from nothing. Perhaps it exists first as potential, waiting for your attention, choices, and inner vision to give it form. Across history, spiritual traditions have spoken about the creative power of consciousness. Today, ideas from modern physics are often used to inspire a similar question. Could reality contain far more possibilities than the one we are experiencing right now? Seen this way, imagination becomes more than escapism. It becomes the inner space where a different version of life can first be conceived, before it is reflected in the way you think, feel, choose, and act. But if new possibilities are always available, then an important question remains. Why do we keep experiencing the same reality again and again? The answer may begin with the state of consciousness we are occupying right now. Look honestly at your life right now. I mean, really look. You are currently living inside what I call a particular state of consciousness. But hear me, it is not the only state open to you. Right now, countless other versions of reality are waiting for you to claim them into being. And yet so many of us remain locked inside the same recurring loop of assumption, replaying identical patterns, generating identical results, feeling identical frustrations, wondering why nothing ever shifts, even as we ache for something more. Let me tell you something that will set you free. You're not stuck because of fate, or destiny, or forces beyond your control. I know this firsthand, my friend. I've walked through that valley of limitation myself, convinced I was at the mercy of outside forces. But here's the truth that might catch you off guard, something most people never come to see. You're stuck because your whole system, your very consciousness, is still tuned to your old assumptions about who you are and what's possible for you. The quantum field doesn't respond to your desires. It responds only to your assumptions. An assumption, even a false one, if held long enough, hardens into fact. This isn't mere philosophy. It's the fundamental law that governs your entire experience of reality. Everything you've ever lived through began as an assumption held in consciousness, and the creative principle within you brought it into form simply because you believed it to be true. I remember when this principle first landed for me. I was young, working in my father's tailor shop in Barbados, dreaming of something more, but with no idea how to close the gap between where I stood and where I longed to be. I'd watch wealthy tourists pass through the shop and assume they belonged to some entirely different world than mine. But eventually I came to understand that consciousness is the only reality, and that by shifting my assumptions about myself, I could genuinely shift my world. I used to think, and maybe you have too, that wanting something badly enough would be enough to bring it about. I'd lie awake at night, aching for a different life, one of freedom, of possibility. But let me share the truth that changed everything for me. Desire alone accomplishes nothing in the realm of creation. Nothing comes from outside. Everything arises from within, from the subconscious. The creative power doesn't answer your wanting. It answers your assuming. Sit with this for a moment. You can want wealth while assuming poverty. You can long for love while assuming you're unworthy of it. You can dream of success while assuming failure. Which of those assumptions do you think the creative principle will honor? Always the dominant one, the one you feel most naturally, most consistently. This is why you can do everything right, repeating affirmations, building vision boards, running visualizations, and still remain stuck in the same limited life. Because underneath your conscious effort, your subconscious assumptions are broadcasting the old story. It's like trying to grow a garden in soil. still saturated with the chemicals of your old beliefs. I once had a student desperate for financial freedom. She spent hours each day visualizing abundance. But every time she opened her wallet, every time she paid a bill, every time she checked her balance, she would tighten with fear. She was trying to plant seeds of abundance in soil soaked with assumptions of lack. The creative principle couldn't honor her conscious wishes because her subconscious assumptions were simply louder. Now here's where modern quantum physics confirms what I've been teaching for decades, and it will astonish you. Every possibility that has ever existed, or could exist, is already vibrating within the quantum field, all at once. You aren't creating something out of nothing. You're selecting which already existing reality to step into. Physicists call this superposition, every possibility present simultaneously, until observation collapses one specific reality into form. But here's the deeper truth most people overlook. You aren't observing reality only with your physical eyes. You're observing, and thereby collapsing, reality through your assumptions, your expectations, your dominant feeling states. The quantum field is responsive, not reactive. It reflects back to you not what you want, but what you assume to be true about yourself and your world. Man's central delusion is believing there are causes other than his own state of consciousness. We look at our circumstances and assume they're the source of our limitations. But circumstances are never causes, they're effects. They're yesterday's assumptions, hardened and crystallized into what we call reality. Tesla understood this when he spoke of energy, frequency, and vibration as the secrets of the universe. He wasn't being poetic, he was describing the literal mechanics by which consciousness creates reality. Your assumptions generate a specific frequency, and that frequency determines which quantum possibility collapses into your lived experience. I remember studying Tesla's work years ago, fascinated by how he could see inventions fully formed in his mind before they existed physically. He would construct machines in imagination, run them, test them, refine them, all before building a single physical prototype. Tesla knew that imagination was the true workshop of creation, that everything in existence first existed in consciousness. But most people try to manifest from the small sliver of consciousness that's awake and aware, while the vast majority of their subconscious remains programmed with old assumptions of limitation, fear, and lack. And the quantum field always answers the loudest signal. It's like trying to tune into a beautiful symphony, while most of your receivers are still locked onto static. Modern neuroscience confirms this. The majority of our behavior runs on subconscious programming, stored patterns, beliefs, and emotional conditioning operating automatically beneath conscious awareness. Pair that with the observer effect in quantum mechanics, and something remarkable emerges. Most of the time, it isn't your conscious intention collapsing reality, it's your subconscious assumptions. This is why people can change jobs, relationships, even cities, and still find themselves reliving the same emotional patterns and outcomes. Nothing external can override an internal assumption that stays unchanged. I've watched it happen again and again. People relocate across the country to escape their troubles, only to recreate the exact same troubles in the new location. So when someone tells me manifestation doesn't work, what they're really saying is, I haven't yet changed the internal observer collapsing my reality. They're trying to transform their world from the wrong level of consciousness. Your subconscious mind, that vast reservoir of assumption, functions like a radio tower, endlessly broadcasting a signal. And the universe, perfectly responsive, tunes into that signal and produces circumstances matching its frequency. If your subconscious broadcasts fear, you'll attract fearful circumstances. If it broadcasts lack, you'll live scarcity. If it broadcasts unworthiness, you'll find yourself in situations confirming that unworthiness. I once worked with a man desperate to find love. He dated, joined clubs, attended every social event imaginable, and somehow always ended up alone. When we dug into his subconscious assumptions, we found that deep down, he believed himself unlovable. As a child, his mother had told him he was too difficult to love, and that belief had taken root like a weed. Every time he met someone new, his subconscious would broadcast that frequency, and potential partners would unconsciously sense it and pull away. He wasn't consciously sabotaging his relationships. His subconscious assumption was doing it for him. Here's something most manifestation teachers miss entirely. Your nervous system doesn't just receive information, it broadcasts it. Every cell in your body carries and transmits the frequency of your assumptions. When your nervous system is wired for survival, scarcity, and fear, it signals threat to the field, even while your mouth is declaring abundance and success. This is why affirmations so often fail. There's an energetic contradiction between what you're saying and what you're assuming at the cellular level. The field responds to the authentic signal, not the performed one. It's like trying to broadcast a love song while your whole being vibrates with fear. You reshape your future most powerfully when your thoughts are directed in a state close to sleep, when effort drops to its bare minimum. In that drowsy, half-waking state, your conscious mind's resistance dissolves, and it becomes far easier to assume the feeling of your wish already fulfilled. I discovered this through personal trial. In my early study of these laws, I struggled to hold positive thoughts during waking hours. My conscious mind kept interrupting with doubt, fear, logical objections. But in that twilight state between sleep and waking, I found I could slip effortlessly into the assumption of my fulfilled desire. It was there that I first successfully used imagination to reshape my circumstances. I was working as a clerk in New York, barely scraping by, when I decided to assume the feeling of being a successful lecturer. Each night, as I drifted towards sleep, I'd picture myself standing before audiences, sharing these truths, feeling the satisfaction of helping others transform their lives. The transformation you're seeking isn't about fighting your present reality. It's about withdrawing your assumption from it and investing that assumption instead in the reality you'd rather experience. Here's the most important point I can offer you. Resisting what currently is only makes it more solidly real in your experience. When I speak of assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, I mean something quite precise. You must feel yourself to be the person for whom your desire is already an established fact, not someone hoping for it, not someone striving toward it, but someone for whom it's simply true. This is what I call living from the end, inhabiting the consciousness of your fulfilled desire so completely it becomes your natural home. If financial freedom is your desire, you must assume the feeling of being financially free. How does a financially free person move through the world? How do they breathe? How do they make decisions? How do they relate to money? Inhabit that consciousness so fully, it becomes your default state. But here's where most students trip up. You cannot assume the state intermittently and expect steady results. To be effective, your assumption can't be a single, isolated act. It must be a sustained attitude of the wish fulfilled. Most people approach manifestation like tourists visiting a foreign country. They pop in briefly, snap a few pictures, then return to the familiar territory of limitation. I remember a woman who attended my lectures in Los Angeles. She was buried in debt, desperate for financial abundance. She'd come to my talks, feel inspired, go home and practice for a few days, then slowly slide back into her old habits of worry and scarcity thinking. One evening after a lecture, she came up to me and said, "Neville, I've been practicing your techniques for months and nothing has changed. What am I doing wrong? I asked her to walk me through her practice. She described sporadic effort, brief bursts of inspiration, followed by days of doubt. I told her, "My dear, you're visiting the state of abundance, the way a tourist visits a city. You check in briefly, then check out, and return to your familiar hotel of limitation. The quantum field doesn't respond to occasional visits to your desired state. It reorganizes itself around whatever state you inhabit most consistently. This is why scattered visualization sessions produce scattered results, while sustained assumption produces inevitable manifestation. You must take up permanent residence in the state of your fulfilled desire. That doesn't mean forcing yourself to feel good constantly or denying real challenges. It means building the capacity to return again and again to your assumed state, regardless of outer circumstance. When old patterns resurface, and they will, you don't fight them. You simply return to your assumption, with the quiet persistence of a river finding its way to the sea. Every time you notice yourself slipping back into an old assumption and gently redirect toward the new one, you're literally rewiring your quantum signature. New neural pathways begin forming in your brain. Your body begins broadcasting a new frequency. You're teaching the field a new pattern to reflect back to you. This is the true work of consciousness, not some dramatic overnight transformation, but the patient, repeated return to your chosen state of being. Let me offer you a practical framework for this sacred practice. Before your feet touch the floor each morning, before you check your phone, before you engage with the world's version of reality, take a moment to feel yourself as the person you've decided to become. What frequency are you carrying into this day? Assumptions of lack or abundance, struggle or ease? For over 40 years, I've made it my daily practice to ask myself upon waking, who am I choosing to be today? Not what will I do, not what do I hope happens. Who am I choosing to be? Because who you are in consciousness determines what you experience in the world. Throughout the day, practice what I call embodied response. Notice when your actions, your words, your choices align with your assumed identity, and when they contradict it. If you've assumed abundance, are you acting generously or fearfully? If you've assumed love, is your heart open or armored? I once knew a man who had assumed the identity of a successful businessman. But every time an opportunity to invest or take a calculated risk arose, he retreated into fear-based thinking. He'd claimed to believe in abundance, but his actions revealed his true assumptions, that resources were scarce, that opportunity was rare, that he couldn't trust his own judgment. His outer circumstances stayed limited, not because the universe was withholding success from him, but because his actions constantly contradicted his stated desires. He was like a man insisting he believes in his destination, while consistently walking the opposite direction. Each night before sleep, review your day, not hunting for mistakes, but checking for alignment. Where did you successfully hold your assumption? Where did you slip back into old patterns? Use this awareness for course correction, not judgment. Conscious creation isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. Remember this profound truth. A change of feeling is a change of destiny. Every moment you sustain the feeling of your wish fulfilled, you're literally collapsing new quantum possibilities into your experience. This isn't abstract theory. It's the most practical instruction I can give you. Dare to believe in the reality of your assumption and watch the world play its part in its fulfillment. The world has no choice but to conform to a persistent assumption. Persistence doesn't mean force. It means a natural, effortless return to your chosen state. Like a river always finding its way to the sea, your consciousness should flow naturally toward the assumption of your fulfilled desire. When doubt rises, and it will, don't wrestle with it. Simply return to your assumption. When old patterns surface, gently guide yourself back to your new identity. Let me share a story that illustrates this beautifully. Years ago, I met a young woman whose doctors had told her she could never have children. She'd been married 5 years and endured countless failed medical procedures. When she came to my lectures, she was bitter, defeated, convinced motherhood was impossible for her. I taught her to assume the feeling of being a mother, not hoping to become one, not striving toward it, but feeling herself to already be one. Each night she'd fall asleep, imagining herself holding her baby, feeling its weight in her arms, hearing its soft breathing. For months, nothing shifted outwardly. The doctors still insisted conception was impossible. Her husband began losing hope, but she held her assumption, returning to that feeling again and again. The gap between assumption and manifestation exists to test the strength of your conviction. Will you hold your assumption despite contrary evidence? Will you keep feeling the reality of your wish fulfilled even while the outer world hasn't caught up yet? This woman did exactly that. She held her assumption with the tenacity of someone who knows consciousness is the only reality. And eventually, against every medical prediction, she conceived. Today she has 3 children, all born after doctors declared it impossible. When outer circumstances seem to contradict your assumption, remember, they're reflecting your previous assumptions, not your current ones. There's always a bridge of incidents connecting assumption to manifestation. You don't need to figure out how it will happen. You only need to maintain the assumption that it is happening. This brings us to one of the most important concepts I can share: living from the end. When you live from the end, you're not working toward a goal, you're operating from the established fact of its fulfillment. You make decisions, speak, and act from the consciousness of someone for whom the desire is already real. This creates what quantum physicists call retroactive causation, the future state influencing the present moment, drawing to you the experiences and circumstances aligned with your assumed identity. It's as though your future self reaches back through time, guiding your present self toward the inevitable fulfillment of your assumption. Here's something that will reshape your entire understanding. You're not trying to get somewhere, you're recognizing you're already there. The version of you living your desired life already exists within the quantum field. Your task is to assume its identity so completely that you become it. I learned this through my own journey to America. While still in Barbados, I began assuming the feeling of being in New York. I had no idea how I'd get there. No money for passage, no connections, no opportunities. But I felt myself there so completely, it became more real to me than my actual surroundings in Barbados. Every night I fell asleep, imagining myself walking those streets, feeling the city's energy, seeing myself woven into that vibrant, creative community. I lived so fully in that assumption that when the chance to travel finally came, it felt like natural inevitability rather than sheer luck. This is the power of assumption. It doesn't merely attract circumstances, it creates them. When you assume something as true, with enough conviction and persistence, the whole universe conspires to make it so. Doors open, people appear, opportunities arise, all in perfect timing to support your assumption's fulfillment. But most people give up too soon. They assume for a while, see no immediate change, and return to old patterns. They don't grasp that the gap between assumption and manifestation isn't punishment, it's preparation. The universe is reorganizing itself around your new assumption, and reorganization takes time. In the next 24 hours, I want you to do one thing that belongs entirely to the version of you living your desired reality. Not a half-hearted gesture, not a tentative step, a full assumption of that identity through one specific action, choice, or internal shift. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It only needs to be genuine. When you do this, you'll feel something significant stir inside you. You'll sense the quantum field responding to your new signal. You'll experience what I call the thrill of answered prayer, the moment you feel the creative principle stirring in response to your assumption. Let me tell you about a man who came to one of my lectures in New York. He was unemployed, job hunting for months, with no success. After hearing me speak about assumption, he decided to assume the feeling of being employed in his ideal role. The next morning, instead of his usual casual job hunting clothes, he dressed as though he were already working in the position he desired. He put on his best suit, tied his tie carefully, and looked at himself in the mirror, not as an unemployed man hoping for work, but as a successful professional getting ready for another day at his fulfilling job. That simple act of dressing from his assumed identity shifted something inside him. He carried himself differently, spoke differently, even thought differently. Within a week, he received a call for an interview at a company he'd never applied to. A colleague had recommended him for a role that matched his desire perfectly. The interview went beautifully because he wasn't trying to convince them to hire him. He was already convinced he belonged there. This is assumption in action. When you truly feel yourself to be something, you naturally act from that consciousness, and the world responds to the authenticity of your assumption. You're not waiting for reality to shift before feeling conviction. You're generating the conviction, and in that moment, you'll finally understand. You are not at the mercy of external circumstance. You are the operative power in your world. Your imagination, directed by assumption and sustained by feeling, is the creative force shaping every detail of your experience. Let me share something that happened to me just last year. I was preparing for a series of lectures on the West Coast, and I began imagining the audiences as unusually receptive and engaged. I didn't hope they would be, I assumed it. I felt the energy of connection, the joy of sharing truth with eager minds, the satisfaction of watching understanding dawn on their faces. When I arrived for the first lecture, I found the largest, most enthusiastic audience I'd ever addressed. People had traveled hundreds of miles to be there. The connection was immediate and deep, exactly as I'd imagined. But here's the crucial point. I didn't manufacture that audience through wishful thinking. I collapsed an already existing possibility into my experience through the power of assumption. The mystics have always known imagination as the divine creative faculty. When Scripture describes God creating the world through the Word, it's describing the same process I'm teaching you. Consciousness speaking reality into existence. You are made in the image of this creative power, which means you too can speak your world into being through the creative act of assumption. But there's a real difference between idle daydreaming and the kind of imaginative creation I'm describing. Idle daydreaming is passive. You drift along with whatever images arise. Creative imagination is active. You deliberately direct your consciousness toward a specific end and hold that direction until it hardens into fact. Scripture tells us God saw everything He had made and it was good. That seeing isn't passive observation. It's creative recognition. When you see your desired reality through the eyes of imagination, when you recognize it as already accomplished, when you feel its goodness as present fact, you're using the same creative power that brought worlds into being. I often tell my students that Scripture isn't merely historical record. It's a psychological drama unfolding within every individual's consciousness. Abraham represents faith awakening. Moses represents the law-giving aspect of consciousness. Jesus represents the perfect assumption of divine identity. These aren't people who lived long ago. They're states of consciousness available to you right now. When Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," He was describing the eternal present of consciousness. Your desired reality doesn't sit somewhere in a distant future. It exists right now, in the eternal present of imagination. When you assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled, you're stepping into that eternal now, closing the apparent gap between desire and fulfillment. I remember a woman who came to me years ago, desperate to reconcile with her estranged husband. They'd been separated over a year, and he'd already filed for divorce. Lawyers were involved, papers drawn up, and everyone urged her to accept the marriage was over. But I taught her to assume the feeling of reconciliation. Each night she'd fall asleep imagining her husband beside her, feeling his presence, his love, his commitment to their marriage. She'd wake and, for a moment, feel genuinely surprised to find herself alone. Her imagined experience had become that real to her. Her friends thought she'd lost touch with reality. Her family urged her to accept the facts. But she held her assumption with the persistence of someone who understands that consciousness is reality, and that what we call the physical world is simply consciousness crystallized into form. It took 6 months, but gradually her husband began to soften. He started calling, then visiting, then staying the night. The divorce papers were never filed, and today, 15 years later, theirs is one of the strongest marriages I know. She didn't manipulate or coerce him. She simply assumed the feeling of their love so completely it became the dominant reality for them both. This is what I mean when I say an assumption, persisted in, hardens into fact. The facts of your current life are simply yesterday's assumptions, crystallized. Change your assumptions, hold to them, and your facts will change too. But here's what most people miss. The interval between assumption and manifestation isn't dead time. It's the most creative period of your life. During this stretch, the universe is reorganizing itself around your new assumption, building the bridge of incidents that will carry your desire into form. Your task during this period isn't to figure out how it will happen. It's simply to maintain the assumption that it is happening. Every time you slip back into doubt, every time you return to the old story, you're essentially casting a vote for your old reality. But every time you return to your assumption, you're voting for the new one. Democracy isn't just a political system, it's a cosmic principle. The universe is constantly tallying votes on which reality you want to experience, and every thought, every feeling, every assumption is a ballot. The reality with the most votes wins. This is why persistence matters so much, not because you're forcing something to happen, but because you're consistently voting for what you want to experience. I've seen entire lives transformed through this understanding. I've watched the sick become well, the poor become prosperous, the lonely find love, all through the simple but profound practice of assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled and holding that assumption until it hardened into fact. The quantum field modern physics describes is the same field mystics have long called the mind of God. It's the responsive, creative medium in which every possibility exists simultaneously, waiting for consciousness to select which one to experience. You're not separate from this field. You're an individualized point of consciousness within it, with the power to collapse any possibility into your experience. This is why I say man is God in action, not because you're greater than the creative principle, but because you are the creative principle, individualized. The same power that spins galaxies and governs planetary orbits is the power that beats your heart and shapes your thoughts. When you assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled, you're putting this cosmic creative power to its most practical use. But power without wisdom can be dangerous. This is why I stress assuming only what you genuinely desire, what would bring joy and fulfillment not just to you, but to everyone involved. The creative power is impartial. It manifests whatever you consistently assume, regardless of whether it helps or harms. I once knew a man so consumed with getting revenge on someone who'd wronged him that he spent months assuming the feeling of his enemy's downfall. His assumption was so persistent, so emotionally charged, that it eventually manifested. His enemy really did suffer a string of failures and setbacks. But the man who'd assumed this revenge felt no satisfaction. He felt hollow, remorseful, realizing his creative power could have built something beautiful instead of tearing something down. This taught me something important about the responsibility that comes with creative power. Once you understand that your assumptions shape reality, you must also accept responsibility for the kind of reality you're building. Are you using this power to create a world of love, abundance, and joy? Or are you unconsciously building a world of fear, scarcity, and limitation? The choice is always yours, made in every moment through the assumptions you hold and the feelings you entertain. This is why self-observation matters so much in this work. You must become aware of your habitual patterns of thought and feeling, because those patterns are literally sculpting your experience of reality. Most people are unconscious creators, assuming by default rather than by design, inheriting assumptions from parents, culture, past experience, and then wondering why life feels predetermined. But you hold the power to break free from inherited limitation and create deliberately, according to your highest vision of what's possible. You must assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled, until it carries the full sensory vividness of reality. This isn't about visualizing, it's about feeling. You must feel yourself as the person you want to become, so completely it becomes more real to you than your current circumstances. I remember struggling with this concept of feeling when I first learned these principles. I'd try to visualize what I wanted, but the images felt flat, lifeless. It wasn't until I learned to feel my way into my desires that they began manifesting reliably. When I wanted financial abundance, for instance, I didn't just picture money in a bank account. I felt the security of financial freedom, the ease of spending without anxiety, the joy of being able to help others generously. I felt the weight of money in my pocket, the satisfaction of paying bills with gratitude instead of dread. Once you reach the point where your desired state feels more real than your current circumstances, manifestation becomes inevitable. The quantum field cannot resist a persistent, feeling-full assumption. It must collapse into form, whatever you've assumed to be true. This isn't faith in the religious sense. It's faith in the scientific sense, informed confidence grounded in an understanding of the laws of consciousness. Once you grasp that consciousness is the only reality, and that the physical world is simply consciousness made visible, assuming the feeling of your wish fulfilled becomes as natural as breathing. But most people approach manifestation with a beggar's mindset. They come to the universe hat in hand, hoping for a few scraps of good fortune. They pray with desperation instead of assumption, visualize with yearning instead of acceptance, affirm with hope instead of conviction. This beggar's mindset actually repels what you want, because it's built on the assumption that you don't already have it. How can you attract abundance while assuming scarcity? How can you manifest love while assuming unworthiness? How can you build success while assuming failure? The consciousness of a fulfilled desire is something else entirely. It's not hoping, wanting, or needing. It's simply being. When you assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled, you're not asking for something. You're accepting something that already exists. You're not hoping it happens. You're recognizing that it already has. This shift, from hoping to accepting, from wanting to being, is the single most important transformation you can make in how you approach manifestation. It's the difference between begging and commanding, between asking and declaring, between trying and knowing. You're not the same person who began listening to these words.